So, does anybody here have subscription to streaming services like Netflix or, what else have we got? Disney Plus maybe? Amazon Prime? Sky Movies? iPlayer? ITV Now? The list goes on, doesn't it? Now, do any of those who've got those streaming services admit to binge watching box sets or series from television? I think there's not enough hands up, personally. If you binge watch things, do you talk about what you've been watching at school or at work or with your friends and family, and maybe recommend what somebody should watch next when they've finished what they're watching now? In our family, we always have to check where we're at so that we don't give any spoilers and let people know what happens next. Well, we recently started as a family watching Grey's Anatomy, and what a dangerous rabbit hole that's been to go down. I mean, we're all so busy, aren't we? We've got no time for anything, and yet somehow, between us, Harriet is now ahead of us, but between us, we've managed to watch 16 series. Now, that said, Simon would view this as an investment because, much like his ability to become a self-appointed expert in cooking, dancing, and singing, thanks to TV shows, we now seemingly have a man in our family who's acquired a medical degree. And perhaps this is the way that we save the NHS. Who needs to go to medical school for 5 years when you can just binge watch Grey's Anatomy? But what I think we've actually lost sight of is that the Bible is perhaps the best box set of all time. Where else would you find stories of creation and destruction, love and loss, crimes of passion, murder and sacrifice? The thing is, accessing these glorious accounts takes a little more effort than just passively sitting in front of the TV. So today, we find ourselves at Series 8, Episode 3 of the Bible. And that's the passage that Eileen's brought to us today. I appreciate that some of us here, especially our younger people who've been out in Sunday school, will have missed episodes 1 and 2. So in true Netflix style, I thought that we should perhaps have a little recap with some padding that I've found in Jewish teaching as I've been preparing for today. So we'll do the recap, we'll focus on today's reading, and then we'll consider what the book of Ruth is still telling us today and why it's relevant. All without any spoilers for Rob's sermon next week. So, previously in Ruth. The land of Israel had been hit by a terrible famine, and Elimelech, a great and wealthy man, had fled to Moab with his wife Naomi and their 2 sons in order to maintain his material wealth and avoid hunger. Once settled in Moab, his sons married 2 sisters, Orpah and Ruth, who were actually daughters of the king of Moab. Marrying outside of the Jewish faith was frowned upon, as the Jewish bloodline would not be pure. And so Orpah and Ruth would have been regarded as muggles, for those of you who are familiar with Harry Potter. They lived in Moab for about 10 years, and during that time, Elimelech and his sons both all died, leaving no heirs. So we now find that Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are widows, and Naomi hears that the famine is over in Israel, and she decides that it's perhaps time to go back home to Bethlehem. This must have taken tremendous courage, as she was returning home to face family and friends that they had chosen as a family to abandon and not help during the famine. The journey would have been an arduous one, taking at least 7 to 10 days on foot. They did not have planes, trains, and automobiles back then. So Naomi and the daughter-in-laws are on the journey, and she presents them with a get-out-of-jail-free card. She tells them that they do not have to go with her, they have no obligation to stay, and they can go back to their father's house and start a new family without her. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was a princess of Moab, and I could have gone back to the palace and the fine life, I'm not sure I would have continued down that dusty road with a miserable old woman. She loves them enough to let them go. She knew that they might not be welcome in Bethlehem, as they would be aliens in a foreign land. Orpah, maybe I'm a bit like Orpah, decides to take Naomi up on her offer and returns home. Now, interestingly, Jewish teaching tells us that she went on to have a famous son who we hear about later in the Bible. and his name was Goliath. This will take on new light once next week's chapter unfolds. Ruth, however, loved her mother-in-law very much and chooses to remain with her and make the journey to Bethlehem. In this act, she chooses to leave behind all of her physical wealth and comforts, and she also makes a spiritual journey and becomes the most celebrated convert to Judaism of all time. On their arrival in Bethlehem, it's said that the town was gathered to attend the funeral of the wife of Boaz. He was regarded as the best leader and judge of a generation, a most important man. The stage is set. Ruth, the Moabite princess, goes on to provide for Naomi by collecting grain left over by the harvesters in Boaz's fields. Her humility, hard work, gentle demeanor, and faithfulness grant her favor with Boaz, and he instructs his workers to keep her safe and allows her to collect more grain than he is obliged to let her. So now, folks, we find ourselves up to date with the story. And this next chapter that we've heard today must be interpreted really carefully, not least because there are small people in this room. Context, purpose, and translation are key in understanding what happened that night on the threshing floor. On first reading, this passage could have been lifted straight out of a racy novel, or perhaps a scene from Bridgerton. If you know, you know. It seems as though Naomi is encouraging Ruth to effectively seduce Boaz, thus forcing him to marry her in order to maintain both of their reputations. Naomi knows that Boaz is related to her deceased husband, and as such, he should play the role of kinsman redeemer by marrying Ruth, fathering a child, and securing Elimelech's name, estate, and titles for future generations. It is important, though, to consider that Boaz must have known that this opportunity was available to him, but for some reason, he didn't step forward. Naomi also knows that having a princess of Moab scrabbling around in a field for leftover grain is no way to live, and it certainly is not the life to which she was previously accustomed. She decides that they need to be bold, to make the first move. Boaz is a good and noble man, and perhaps he needs to be reminded of his duty to his relatives. The night in question is the last night of the harvest, and the collected sheaves of barley are to be threshed. That is, to separate the grain from the stalks. We often use the saying to separate the wheat from the chaff, which means to distinguish the good from the bad. And I'm sure the symbolic meaning of Ruth's advances and the timing of them would not have been lost on the readers of this time, and perhaps we should remember that now. After the threshing, there would have been a celebration, because it's the end of the harvest. The workers would eat, drink, and be merry. Naomi was probably hoping that this would leave Boaz in a good mood, and perhaps more amenable to marriage. Now, some commentaries actually tell us that in telling Ruth to bathe, anoint herself, and put on her best clothes, that Naomi is telling Ruth to dress for seduction, consummation of marriage, and setting herself up for the rest of her life, probably in that order. However, the word used for clothing in the Jewish text is simlah, which is actually an outer garment that covers everything except the head, and was often used as a blanket. That doesn't sound to me like the sort of outfit somebody might wear if they were wanting to seduce somebody. Could it be that this was more the advice of an elderly relative, not wanting Ruth to catch a chill if she was out all night? Indeed, the next morning, Boaz instructs Ruth to fill her cloak, not her dress, with barley, so as not to go back empty-handed. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to fill my wedding dress with grain. The same commentaries also suggest that uncovering his feet is a euphemism for something else. The more wholesome version is that it's a declaration of intention to marry, or that Boaz would simply wake up sooner if his feet was cold. When Boaz does wake up, he's surprised to find someone at his feet. We have to assume that it was so dark that he couldn't make out who it was, because he asks who it is. She placed herself in a position of servitude, at his feet, asks him to cover her with his cloak, and reminds him of his position as kinsman redeemer. In this moment, Ruth is both bold and humble at the same time. She's not afraid to pursue Naomi's plan of securing a future for both of them, but she's also gracious in not trying to trick Boaz into marriage by seduction. She is trusting in a righteous outcome, that Boaz will in fact cover her with his wings of protection, a beautiful image that we often use with Christ protecting us. Now, Boaz is believed to have been an older man, and one text I found suggests that he was actually 84. And so it is perhaps of no surprise that he was surprised that she had chosen him over a younger man. Maybe that's why he didn't come forward of his own volition. He asked God to bless her, as he believes that the act of choosing him is even greater than the faithfulness she's shown by choosing to stay with the lonely, bitter old lady. Now, Boaz doesn't balk at the fact that Ruth is actually a Moabite. He acknowledges her faith, her newfound faith, and her worthiness to be his bride. And he commits to marry her if the more closely related man, who has not volunteered either, will not. His concern in upholding her good name is such that they get up when it's still dark so that she can leave the threshing floor without being seen or recognised. And then he sets out, while it's still dark, to resolve the matter in the town. So why is this story still relevant to us today? This is really tricky because I can't reveal too much about the next chapter, but suffice to say that without Ruth, the Bible would be a much shorter book. This story speaks of the love of God and the love of man, of duty and of purpose. It's agape love, a deep and profound sacrificial love which transcends and persists regardless of circumstance. It shows us how God blesses us in often surprising ways, and of how our character and demeanour can often result in a great reward. Now, there is a Jewish festival called Shavuot, which is 50 days after Passover. It celebrates the early harvest, which has just happened in this passage, and the giving of the Torah to the Jews on Mount Sinai. And that is why the Jews from all nations were gathered in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. As part of that festival, it is custom to stay up all night and read the Torah and other scriptures, with particular attention to the book of Ruth. Her conversion to the Jewish faith and her grafting onto the Jewish rootstock allows her family line to flourish and bear great fruit. And any of the gardeners amongst you might be able to explain later over lunch what rootstock and grafting onto rootstock means. Ruth was a Gentile who chose to turn her back on what had been before, to embrace God as her own and put her trust in him. So where does the gospel reading come into all of this? That had me thinking for quite a long time. Well, I guess it's at a wedding. And we're going to hear about a wedding very soon. But really, I think it's more about that as Christians, we too put our trust in the Lord our God. We are part of his vine, as we're adopted brothers and sisters in Christ. We have been grafted onto that rootstock. So let us bear fruit so that we can be turned from water into wine. Some of us will be a zesty white. I say that for Harriet, it's disgusting. But others will be a full-bodied red. But what you need to be assured of is that whatever variety of grape you are, in God's house, there is room for everyone. Amen.